Great. Thanks so much, Michael, for that introduction and for helping organize this whole thing with Nadia and other people at New Labor Forum and SLU's public programming team. Let me also thank and welcome all the people joining us from home offices everywhere, whether you're on the East Coast or West Coast or somewhere else. It's great to have you for what I think is going to be, or what I know is going to be, a really great discussion on housing justice and how the progressive left can approach what seems to be an impending or an ongoing crisis related to housing affordability. So just some housekeeping things. Me and Miriam Greenberg are going to talk for around 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. And so if you have questions, just remember to put them in the chat when they come to you. So just to begin, I'm really, really excited to talk to my friend, Professor Miriam Greenberg, who's also a long standing friend of CUNY SLU and a collaborator with many of our colleagues. And especially to talk to her about her article, which I have a marked up copy here, The Progressive Disjuncture on Land Use and Housing, Learning from the Leftmost City, which is forthcoming in the fall issue of the journal New Labor Forum. So Professor Greenberg is based at UC Santa Cruz in the Department of Sociology. She is the chair and the author of a number of really terrific books that many students at SLU should be familiar with because we assign selections of them all the time. Some of those include The City is the Factory, New Solidarities and Spatial Strategies in an Urban Age, which came out in 2017 and was co-authored with Penny Lewis. In 2014, she published Crisis Cities, Disaster and Redevelopment in New York and New Orleans with Kevin Fox Gotham. And in 2008, she published Branding New York, How a City in Crisis Was Sold to the World. All books that I would encourage you to check out. With that, Miriam, welcome. Yeah, I've already told you this before, but I feel very lucky to have read kind of various editions and versions of this paper, and I just think it's really important, especially now, given the kind of end of the eviction moratorium, on kind of framing the issue and pointing to the ways in which there are some serious challenges for those on the left who are committed to housing justice that they need to confront. I thought I'd start with a question that kind of, because I know Michael talked a bit about the newest publication, or the report that's just been released. So the paper that we're going to talk about is actually part of a larger research project, and kind of the argument you develop in the New Labor Forum piece comes out of that. So could you just tell us about what that project is about? Because I think it's super interesting.
Sure, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you and with the School of Labor and Urban Studies. And I'm so excited to get to think about this together with New Yorkers and the ramifications that it may have beyond Santa Cruz. And I really have appreciated your help on the article, and that's forthcoming. The argument really grows out of work that my colleague Steve McKay and I were working on for a number of years on this report, No Place Like Home, Affordable Housing in Crisis in Santa Cruz, that tries to deal with this puzzle of how a city that is known to be, and a region really, is known to be as progressive as Santa Cruz is, could end up with one of the worst affordable housing crises in California, in the United States, and actually in the world. It's remarkable, but Santa Cruz is known to be amongst the top 5 least affordable places to live in the world. And, so in a sense, it's similar to and a more extreme case of unaffordability crises that are affecting cities all over the place, including New York City. And so, moving from New York to take the job at UCSC, and having dealt with a lot of, housing issues in New York, and moving to a place as an urban sociologist, and people asking me like, why are you coming to Santa Cruz as an urban sociologist? Like, what's urban about Santa Cruz? And realizing that it had as bad, if not worse, of a housing crisis, I became fascinated with this question and this kind of disjuncture between progressive politics that appeared to be concerned with, aware of, concerned with, and seeking to address a whole host of other, hot button progressive issues on the environment, on questions of immigration. Santa Cruz is one of the first sanctuary cities, on GLBTQ rights, on a whole host of things, but not housing, at least not effectively. And so trying to figure out where that disjuncture came from, that lack of attention to the issue, as well as not only a kind of inertia on the issue, but actually in some cases, what we can talk about today, which is a fracturing and really contentious politics around the issue amongst people otherwise considered to be together on the left.
Unmute myself. Yeah, so maybe we could get into that disjuncture, the nature of it. I mean, part of it, what I gather is that it emerged out of your, experiences organizing around, Measure M, which we should probably explain, or Proposition 10, which we should also explain, and then just what you encountered.
Yeah. So, well, it was this amazing opportunity, as many of us who do community engaged kinds of, regional, local research, in working on, Professor McKay and I, together with over 200 students, were analyzing the history of the affordable housing crisis. We also conducted a survey of around 2,000 renters. The project really focused on how the housing crisis was experienced by renters in our region. And we divided it up by area within the region. And you can go to our website. I'm going to just put it in the chat here. Oh, wait, sorry, I don't have the right link, but in a minute, I'll put the link to the report, but you can go to the map of Santa Cruz and you can analyze the survey data by demographics, by geography, and see how it's playing out. Also by issue, so we were looking at the impacts of the affordable housing crisis in terms of rent burden, displacement, issues around major problems with housing, as well as overcrowding. We did all this work for a number of years. And then in the midst of doing this movement was really burgeoning in Santa Cruz, as well as statewide, around rent control, because clearly the affordable housing crisis was having this disproportionate impact on tenants. And so this became an opportunity for us, a kind of exciting opportunity to watch on the ground people responding to, and students would be engaged with bringing the research to some of these kinds of organizing spaces, while also trying to analyze, the debates that were going on. And we had a number of public events. We brought all kinds of folks together to debate these kinds of issues. There was a big debate between the sociologists on the project and then others on our campus who are in the economics department on rent control, which was a pretty interesting event. And clearly the rent control issue was enormously contentious, and divided the city, actually. And one of the efforts on the part of students and other tenants locally was to get a rent control measure on the ballot for the first time in 30 years in Santa Cruz. It had failed 3 times in the late 70s and early 80s, and no one thought it was possible to bring it back. And they did. They got the required signatures to put it back on the ballot. Meanwhile, there were similar efforts going on in tens of cities around California. And some of the excitement around this, I should say the local one was called Measure M. There were other measures in cities around the state. And some of the excitement around this was to do with a proposition that was also going to be on the 2018 ballot called 10, which would have gotten rid of, well, it would have got certain provisions within a law in the state, which is a common kind of a preemption law that many states passed in the 1990s to try to blunt the power of rent control at the local scale. A number of cities in California, bigger cities like Oakland and San Francisco already have rent control, but there's a whole question about how powerful it can be, how many houses built past a certain date, how many can apply for rent control, can it apply to single family homes versus multifamily homes and so forth. And this law really preempted that, made it only only multifamily homes, only houses built before 1994 and so forth. And so rent control is quite weak in the state as a result. There's a number of states nationwide that have similar preemption laws. And so 10 would have gotten rid of that and made the passage of Measure M and all these other measures so much more powerful. So people were very excited about that possibility. But of course, that also really mobilized opposition in a very, very big way. And while we might have thought that the opposition would be largely from, what your colleague Sam Stein and friend and colleague Sam Stein writes about as the real estate state, that organized and have very powerful lobbying group behind the real estate industry, which is enormously powerful in California and was behind the Costa-Hawkins Act, this preemption act that was passed in the 1990s in the first place to blunt the power of rent control. That was not the only force behind the opposition. They did spend over $1 million to oppose it in Santa Cruz, which is pretty remarkable given the size of our little town. But at the same time, many homeowners joined with the real estate state, joined with powerful real estate lobbying groups to oppose it. And it really divided the city. And neighbors were against neighbors, landlords were against tenants. And it became one of the most divisive issues that we'd ever experienced. And it was visualized by signs all over town. In the article, I include one of those signs that says "No on M, too expensive, too extreme," which is sitting next to, on someone's front lawn, another sign saying "Black Lives Matter.
We believe in science."
We
Yeah.
believe in science. Kindness
Yeah.
is everything, and so forth. Kind of a famous sign, showing proud support for all kinds of other progressive causes. In any case, those "No on M" signs blanketed the city. And many tenants who lived in houses that they were renting from, because there's a lot of single family home renters, couldn't put their own signs, in the lawns because they were tenants. And so it was just created a very hostile environment for tenants as well.
So part of what you're arguing in the piece is that this is this disjuncture, which is captured, I think, perfectly in that image, of progressives who are progressive on everything outside of their property line, or progressive on everything except, the fact that they own a home and want total control and power over it, is endemic to, it's not just Santa Cruz, right? Or it's a problem with progressives more generally. So, one of the questions I wanted to ask was, how the experience of other cities, either with Measure M or Proposition 10, or, to what degree where do you see this playing out in other places in California or elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, and I think that this question of why you can be progressive on every other issue, but when it comes to housing, there's somehow, it's like this kind of third rail in a lot of left alliances, progressive coalitions, and why that's the case. And we do see that. We had a number of events where we had people from around the state come to Santa Cruz to talk about this. And it's pervasive in small towns and suburbs, as well as in big cities. So in San Francisco and LA, and San Jose and the big cities in California. So the idea that it's only a suburban problem is really, I think, not the case. And I think it's also true in New York and other big cities around the country, at the same time that some of the issues may be distinct. But I do think that it's important for the left to focus on the different kinds of political interests often held by homeowners versus renters, and not to be overly, let's say, like instrumentalist about it. Like people are only, there's a kind of longstanding hypothesis in the social sciences called the home voter hypothesis, that homeowners will vote their housing price interests over and against everything else. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And someone who writes really, really well on this issue is Brian McCabe, Georgetown, who wrote a book also called No Place Like Home, actually, like the title of our project. And he's interested in this kind of longstanding kind of myth but firmly held belief that homeowners are more civically engaged than renters. And they are so because they care so much about their community, because they've invested in their community. And so, as a result, they have this kind of economic interest in getting involved. And what he finds, and what we find, is that yes, homeowners are very, very politically involved, and often, and can be often more so. But that is because they perhaps have more security and more time to be involved, while because of the impacts of the housing crisis, and this was true in the early 80s, with efforts to pass rent control by the Progressive Alliance, and it was true with Measure M, tenants are being buffeted, they're being displaced by the crisis. They're often having to work multiple jobs in order to be able to afford to live. And, there are also some indebted homeowners who are facing similar circumstances. But by and large, to the degree that there's a difference in civic engagement, a lot of that may have to do with the conditions that tenants versus homeowners are facing. And tenants can so easily be, as they say in the article, kind of disappeared by a crisis. So you might have an alliance one day that has all these folks working together on a common issue facing the community, be it environmental, be it to do with schools, what have you. And then, next season, many of those members will have to move, because of rising rents, which in Santa Cruz have been going up 10 to 15% per year for the last, 5 or 6 years. And so you might, so it's often, and, without any security, very hard to hold on to these kinds of coalitions. And we see that. I don't think Santa Cruz is alone in that, in terms of the lack of security, and thus the lack of ability to form kind of political bases in particular communities that are facing gentrification and displacement, for instance, in New York. The final thing I'll say is just that not only is it not true that tenants are less civically engaged than homeowners, but an interesting point from Brian McCabe's work, and that we also found, is that while they may be equally civically engaged, they may get civically engaged in different ways and on different kinds of issues. And so homeowners, have an interest certainly in maintaining the value of their home. They also are concerned increasingly, as a result of growing precarity and lack of a social safety net, in holding on to that home. And at the same time, tenants are interested often in shoring up that safety net. And we could talk more about that. I think that while homeowners may be concerned broadly about a safety net, when it comes to this kind of personal or individualized social safety net, which is the home, that may be where the disjuncture also lies. While tenants and others and progressive homeowners want to expand that safety net associated with housing, homeowners may be looking elsewhere beyond housing to think about the safety net, as well as other kinds of issues to do with quality of life, to do with the environment, and so forth.
Let me try. That was a lot. I'm trying to, let me repeat back a bit. So I think this comes out clearly in the paper, which is it's hard to organize a precarious or precariously housed or unstable, organize people who are in unstable, housing arrangements. That is, as you said, tenants can, their lease expires or the landlord does something or whatever, and they have to leave. And it's hard to organize when you're constantly packing your bags to go to the next place. Then there's also homeowners who, right, have a set of distinct interests, but also are, motivated by precarity themselves to engage in policies or support, policies that shore up their power, and that those are sometimes at odds, but they're sometimes in response to the same kind of feeling of the desire for stability. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I think that's exactly right. And it's not, it's economic. It's also, it's emotional or affectual, it has to do with the home. One of the key things about the home, is as a commodity. It's both something that, we can think about with Marx, this use value, exchange value dimension of the home. It's something that provides so much for us: personal security, physical security, a sense of community and identity, some as well as a commodity that we invest in and that creates wealth. And in the last generation, couple of generations really, as the social safety net has been cut and frayed in all kinds of ways, this individual safety net, the value of it has grown enormously. And thus, people who are maybe, precariously employed, but own a home, people who are seeing their children go increasingly into debt, but own a home, people who are seeing, disinvestment from social services and all kinds of other things that maybe once supported them, but own a home, are saying, we are determined to hold on to this one thing that is both so personally valuable to us and to our families and to our communities. Of course, it is to all of us, right? Mm-hmm. And means so much, and is a projection of who we are as individuals and as a family and as a community. We're going to hold on to that. And we need to, if we're going to survive through this, through these really choppy seas that are, occurring as a result of, all of the cutbacks and deregulation and so forth that neoliberalism has brought to us. And that, as from the work that you all do, the lack of unionization, the lack of security on the job and so forth has brought people are more and more inclined to hold on to a home. And I should say at a time when housing values are continually rising. Of course, there have been housing bubbles and bursts and crises, and not everyone has been able to enjoy this. And there has been very problematic mortgage lending, and there has been, there are racial and class disparities along the lines of homeownership. And it's a very dangerous promise to think that your security can be based in homeownership. Nonetheless, for many people, that has been the solution. And of course, it's something that has been promoted in the United States for generations, that we should all be homeowners. And so there's this kind of status associated with it and kind of cultural belief in it. So that makes it distinctive, and politics around it distinctive as well.
Okay, so here's a this one of the so there's part of the story starts with kind of the demise of Measure M and Proposition 10 in Santa Cruz at the hands of progressives, and but there are other cities in California that have been more successful and more successful in pushing pro-renter kind of legislation. But those are progressives too, right? And they seem like different. So this is a kind of the Twitter. Who are the real progressives, or how do you distinguish between the differences between these places and the various degrees of success they've had?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we're always facing. Who are the true progressives? And it's so true. And I know this special issue came out in the context of the the new Biden administration. And I believe a lot of the articles in the special issues are addressing, what advice for the Biden administration and the arguments, of so many in the Progressive Caucus, which have to do with these very material concerns, linking, for instance, in the Green New Deal for housing, environmental concerns and housing concerns and so forth. And I would say, and really thinking as a collective, and what places and what cities have been able to do that. One of the things a lot of people have been talking about for a while is that as the federal government, the national scale before Biden's victory, and in many state contexts has not been able to go in that kind of a progressive direction, cities have been the kind of bastions for progressivism. And we should learn from cities and so forth. And yet, as we see when we get down to the urban scale, cities are very at odds and vary on this issue. So I think one of the places you look is places where there have been powerful tenants movements, I think has been a really key ingredient in advancing those kind of linked material, environmental, social justice, and equity kinds of concerns. You can have, for instance, in California, there's a lot of progressive environmental policy that, people always say California leads on. And when California passes certain kinds of legislation, other places, it affects industry and other states have to follow suit. But we've also seen that when that has not come hand in hand with affordability, it's had all kinds of contradictory effects on climate, on people moving into areas because they can't afford to live in cities that exacerbate risk of fire, for instance, and all kinds of other problems. So, we see that places that don't allow people to live out those progressive ideals by living and affording to live in the places where they get passed are the places that fall behind. So I would say progressivism depends on taking really seriously, some of the stuff you emphasize in your work around right to the city and the ability for people to afford to live, to commute, to get to work, to have kids in schools in those places and those very basic material concerns alongside of other social justice and environmental concerns.
So this is a question because I know I assume someone will ask it given our audience, but where do labor unions or organized labor fit within, either in Santa Cruz or more generally in the struggle for affordable housing, or where do they fit within these this disjuncture, I guess, between within progressivism?
That is a great question, and I'm glad you raised it. I certainly, when you look at the history of housing in this country, one of the things that we talk about in terms of the policy side of things is the idea that it's like as complex as climate change, you need a whole host of policies to address the housing problem, and we can talk more about it. But, sometimes people have been talking about the 3 Ps: production of new housing, preservation of existing housing, and protection of tenants. So we've been talking a lot about the protection of tenants piece with Measure M. But certainly, how do you produce and preserve good, affordable housing? And the labor movement has been historically one of the major forces behind the production and preservation of affordable housing in this country and around the world. And when we look at cities that are great examples of large amounts of social housing and affordable housing, the labor movement has played a huge role. We look at New York City and the history of places, some of which no longer are run, but were originally created by unions in terms of social housing. Those are some of this, I think, some stellar examples of this. And some folks, for instance, the work of Danielle Donna Cohen, who's in the book with Penny and I wrote on The City is the Factory, talks also about the linked environmental benefits of having dense, affordable housing in the city center, and that we should think about union members and those fighting for that housing as low carbon protagonists, as people who are actually environmentalists, because they recognize the value of keeping people living close to their jobs in good housing and in green housing. And many places in Europe and Latin America have been kind of ahead of us in this regard. So unions play a huge role. I should say, in the No Place Like Home project, we also worked with the local chapter of the SEIU, and they were on a sort of linked project, many of whom were homeowners, and the homeowner politics amongst the labor movement members, particularly the active unionists in SEIU, were distinct from a lot of the other politics of homeowners that we found in Santa Cruz. So I think a lot of union members who are public sector workers for the most part in our region, and see younger generations coming into the union not able to afford to live near their jobs, see their kids not able to afford to live near their jobs, and recognize some of this history, really, of the role of unions in providing housing. We're huge advocates, for instance, for workforce housing, and the idea that unions and cities and regions and states should once again link arms to provide housing for working people.
So by distinct, you mean that they were more inclined to support?
They were much more inclined to support. They were even, a third of them supported increasing rent control, even if it meant that if they were renting out, renting out rooms in their homes, that it meant, affecting their role as a landlord. They supported that far more than other homeowners, and they also supported investing. Another question becomes, do you support, raising your local taxes to pay for social housing? Or do you support regulating the land market to create spaces that are decommodified off the market for building housing? Or should everything be privately kind of owned and occupied? And they supported that to a far greater extent, and were huge supporters of social housing for workers, of workforce housing.
That's great. That once again runs counter to the home voter, or complicates the home voter hypothesis. Right?
Yes.
No, they have. Imagine that people have multiple identities, so homeowners, union members, and that kind of shapes their political outlook on something as complex as housing policy. So we're at 12:40. I that went so quickly. I barely touched the second half of the question. So, but I know there are people here who are who want to have their questions asked and hopefully answered to some degree. So let me just see what some of those questions are. Okay. So this is from Jay. This isn't really a question. What Miriam describes in Left Coast, Santa Cruz, as represented by the lawn signs, is a fine example of what former SIU speaker Ture Reed calls race reductionism, separating racial inequality from political economy. So let's see if we can combine that with another question. My question is about zoning here in New York. Elsewhere in the country, the fights to eliminate single-family zoning have looked a lot like the rent control fight you described. I encounter a lot of people from outside of New York City who bring the same logic into this city's context. This comes up against many entrenched local activists who tend to fight against large rezonings within New York City's boundaries. These older activities are more likely to talk about property warehousing and abandonment than often accompanies gentrification. There is already enough housing, it's just sitting empty. Is this grounded in reality, and how do we unite the New York City fights to the rest of the country, since our urban topology and ownership structure is already starting out different? Oh man, that's I don't know how to combine those. Any comments on those two? I mean, I think, one is about kind of New York City and the uniqueness of, unique New York to some degree. Another is about, the relationship between political economy and struggles for other forms of justice, I guess. I don't know.
I hope that I got the question, but in talking about the 3 Ps, production, preservation, and protection, clearly there's this need to organize around not only, tenant regulating the market for tenants and protecting tenants, but also how do you produce when you have zoning structures that are preventing that on any kind of scale. And in California, we have 75% single family home zoning throughout the state. And, in New York State, it's actually, and throughout the country, there are, more than half of all zoning is along these lines as well. And of course, New York City is famously, so much more dense. On the other hand, I think that the question is pointing out that there are people opposing upzoning of neighborhoods or densifying neighborhoods or changing, not simply or only from single family home to greater densities, but densities, let's say, of 2 or 3 story to above and so forth in different neighborhoods. And it's a tricky thing. I think one of maybe the questions you're going to get to, and that I touch on in the article and want to work more on as this project develops, are the kinds of alliances that can be created between tenants and progressive homeowners who are perhaps NIMBYs, as people call them, the people who want to block development and, for instance, keep, increasing, upzoning and keep development from entering into neighborhoods, as well as what have come to be called YIMBYs, the yes in my backyard. So NIMBYs are not no in my backyard, don't want development, don't want upzoning or, densification. And YIMBYs are saying, yes, stop with the blocking of development. No one can afford to move to these places. It's often been started in the Bay Area, for instance, by people coming for all of these jobs that are being created by Silicon Valley and so forth, who cannot afford a place to live more, anywhere close to where they're working, and are thus contributing to the environmental problems of the region and so forth. And so the YIMBYs and the NIMBYs, that it's often framed in the media that it's simply those two factions battling against one another. And meanwhile, out of that picture, and I use a lot of hand gestures when I talk, so are the people are the tenants, are the people who are saying, A, we want development, but B, we want that development to be affordable to us, right? So some people have called this, and I don't know if you've heard this expression, Kafui, FIMBYs, public housing in my backyard, or SHIMBYs, social housing in my backyard. Certainly in LA, there's a big FIMBY group. And there's a very powerful tenants union in LA that has been advocating this because they're tired of being framed as simply NIMBY because they're opposing luxury developments, So the point about upzoning, the point about zoning is it can sometimes feel like a Trojan horse. It can sometimes feel like this dangerous thing. We saw this under the Bloomberg administration, where they upzoned neighborhoods, they rezoned and upzoned neighborhoods across the boroughs, often for the sake of market rate housing. And that was according to a very market-oriented idea that if you simply increase the amount of housing, that ultimately the supply increase will filter down, will trickle down, so that things will become more affordable, universally. And we've seen this over and again, not to be the case, certainly not if you want to maintain, the integrity of a community. So people may, maybe you're creating more aggregate housing, but people are going to be pushed to all kinds of other neighborhoods and won't be able to hold on to their communities. And so I think the question is really getting at, yes, there are common concerns around zoning. I think New York teaches people in California to be wary of simply advocating this build, grow the supply, densify, upzone approach, which is sometimes framed as the kind of YIMBY approach on its own. And so others are kind of pushing back and saying yes to density, yes to rezoning with regulation. And I think that tenants play, and the left and unions play a huge role in making that argument.
I think there should be a moratorium on acronyms ending in IMBY. And I feel like I can build a large coalition of people who agree.
Yes, right.
There's a good question.
Especially ones called like FIMBY, for instance. It's hard to rally around. Yeah.
There's a good question. I think this is a question that gets on at both maybe some of the contradictions associated with legislation alongside a kind of market approach to housing. So this is from Rob McGahey. The California state legislature is passing laws to limit local zoning and housing control if cities don't meet affordable housing targets. Some of these laws require prevailing wage, unionization, PLAs, or other labor-oriented measures, which others claim raise costs of construction. And I guess, therefore, possibly limiting the amount of housing that's constructed. How should progressives view these interventions from the state? How do they, navigate that kind of issue?
Yeah, wow. So California, and it's particular in some ways. We're not the only state of this nature, but I think much more so than perhaps New York has this kind of local control that it has been written into its laws and its planning. So there is a kind of competition that goes on between localities because they're all empowered to kind of create their own zoning to do, or have been. And so there's often a kind of zero-sum game kind of thing. We want to attract certain kinds of business to our area, and and it's created a lot of inequities regionally as a result of this. In addition, we are a state that has famously passed measures like Proposition 13, which undermine the ability of localities to raise taxes on housing, raise tax revenue on housing, I should say. And so recently, I think there's been a recognition that these kind of quasi-fiefdoms at the local scale need to be overridden by the state if we're going to get any of this housing built. So the supply side argument. That has been very contentious, to say the least. But one of the most powerful pieces has been most recently, it's called SB 35, Senate Bill 35. And all of these developments that can get built if they have a certain amount of affordable housing in them, according to this law, are not subject to local opposition so long as they meet what are called objective standards, so long as they're not going against the general plan in some kind of objective, measurable way. You can no longer use subjective standards like neighborhood quality or quality of life or neighborhood character and so forth, which are typically used. And if you're going to use environmental reasons, because we also have very powerful environmental legislation in California, it has to be demonstrable that it's directly related to the housing. And so this is pushed through a lot of SB 35, as they're called, buildings. And there's a big contentious debate about this in Santa Cruz right now. What should labor say about this? I mean, and I think, so I think that, and there's associated legislation about who's building that housing, and so it's both affecting local control and forcing industry if some of this other legislation passes to build that housing with prevailing wages and with labor, with unionized labor. And of course, I think that is very beneficial for workers in areas. And this is something SEIU, for instance, has been very actively supporting in our region and throughout the state. So there's been an alliance now increasingly with SEIU. Of course, the construction unions are also behind this, and the construction unions have kind of, not always aligned with community groups. So there's some alliance in that way. I think a lot of the devil is in the details in terms of the amount of affordability that's stipulated by the legislation. And in this case, it's 50% affordability, which a lot of unions have been saying is a much higher threshold than even, let's say, inclusionary zoning laws have ever allowed for, which typically are 10, 15, in our case, 20%. I'm now, one of my other hats that I've been wearing is I'm a planning commissioner in Santa Cruz, just to kind of like learn how all of this plays out. And it's been really interesting to be part of these debates, whereas once there would be lines out the door of people opposing new developments because of the passage of some of this legislation. They're trying to organize, they're trying to figure out what to do, but their hands are really tied in a different kind of way because of this new preemption really at the state scale.
So the questions are flooding in, and I'm trying to. So there's just to combine a couple of questions. There seems to be a set of questions on kind of the definition of affordability or affordable housing. Where is this? What can be done for low-income workers or workers working low-income jobs who cannot afford so-called affordable housing. I think that's a very live issue in New York. But then later on, this is a question or comment from Jasmine Sanchez Garcia. Some advocates have conflated affordable and workforce housing, that is combining homelessness, low-income, and middle-class needs together. Yeah. Does such an approach sufficiently address the complexity of the debate, or are cities more successful when they address these issues separately? I think those questions go together. So kind of how do we define affordable housing, and how does how we define it shape what sort of activism, organizing, policy takes shape?
It's a great question. And I was speaking earlier about the local union members who were very much in support of having public sector workers have housing that was provided to some degree by their employer and by the city. And similarly, we're trying to get out ahead on teacher housing. And so the teachers union has supported this along with the school district. And obviously a lot of schools and cities have land that could be easily converted, and the major price that goes into per unit costs for housing is land, and depending on where you're located, also labor, and of course the question of labor conditions and unionized labor, prevailing wage labor, but certainly land is a huge chunk of that. And so there's a real case to be made for a segment of what's sometimes called the missing middle of housing, which is working class people and their need for housing and their need for housing near jobs, to be included in the analysis. And this is a powerful way of doing this, of how to address the lack of affordable housing. On the other hand, it's also often a much easier sell to these homeowners who are subject to this disjuncture, this progressive disjuncture. And so they might say, okay, those folks can be included in some kind of policy, but are we really going to want to build, extremely low and low income housing that would be affordable to those brackets in terms of the area median income, often 30% of the area median, 60% up to or 80% and below of the area median. Often workforce is 80 to 120% of the area median income. Are we going to go below 80? And below 30 even? And how are we going to address, of course, those who are not, who are informally housed and or who are homeless? And I think you need a combination of policies that address that kind of housing. I think one of the real misconceptions is that the private sector can address this, and that something I say in the article, and that I feel like just bears repeating so much, is something that you hear as a kind of common sense amongst developers and people in real estate. It is never profitable to build truly affordable housing. It can be somewhat profitable to build workforce housing, especially when you do these alliances with employers. But it is just simply not profitable to build truly affordable housing, deeply affordable housing. And it requires other solutions. It requires regulation. It requires decommodification. It requires major investment in social housing. And that requires a much larger scale overhaul of the way we think about housing in this country. And so labor unions can get involved, certainly, as they historically have, in providing housing for their workers. but a larger scale policy change needs to happen to address those who are precariously employed, unemployed, those who are living much more on the margins of the housing market.
So we have 2 more minutes, but there's just more and more questions. So this is a combination of a question from John Krinsky, and there's another person who asked about wealth, that is housing as a, I mean, it connects to something you said earlier about, in the context of the privatization of everything, and kind of neoliberal assault on the social safety net. The house is as a store of wealth, and as something that can provide access to a better life, has been central to, in many ways, the success of in Black middle class, or various groups that can access. I phrasing it wrong, but I think this question of progressive policies aimed at increasing home ownership, progressive policies aimed at securing stability for renters, progressive policies aimed at something else, sometimes they align, sometimes they conflict. And so how does wealth building, I guess, fit within that? And is that a goal or a problem?
That's a great question. So, and in the article, and the broader kind of project that is going to grow out of the article, I think I'm interested in this idea of the asset class. And I use the work of a group of scholars now based in Australia, Melinda Cooper, Lisa Atkins, and Martin Konings, and they've written a great new short book called The Asset Economy, based on this argument, that's looking at the growing value of assets, and then the implications of that for those who were lucky enough to have those assets prior to the growth, didn't lose them as a result of the market, the housing market crash and so forth. And I think our work is really trying to join them and saying, what are the politics of the asset class? What becomes the challenge then of forming alliances with the asset class? Because ultimately what we're kind of saying is that there's a critique of that growing wealth to the degree that it's being concentrated as it is. And of course, on the other hand, the alliances that are being formed between the asset class and the real estate state and the real estate industry and so forth. And so I think that it is dangerous to, there's long been an effort to get to say, like, everyone should be a homeowner, in the sense of also potentially depoliticizing the working class and creating fractures like we're talking about today. So it's not like this is unexpected that this would be happening. I don't think it's inevitable, and I think there's all kinds of potential for alliance, and this is what we've kind of also been talking about. But I do think that it is the idea that home ownership as the main goal and the kind of growth of the asset class, as opposed to a realignment of class dynamics more broadly, is one of the problems, and that we have to think more about socializing that wealth, as it were. We need to think more about investing, as I was saying, in social housing, in decommodifying housing, in community land trusts and so forth, because ultimately there will not be enough assets to go around. It will not really be possible, I think, to spread that wealth sufficiently. But that will be a challenge, given that people have invested so heavily. And as you say, that store of wealth is in many cases the one kind of basis that folks have for themselves and future generations in their own particular family. So what does it mean to say we want to create a new kind of a system where that will no longer be such a source, but where schools will not be as expensive. You will not be going into debt putting your kids through college, where your kids will be able to afford to live in affordable housing without you passing it on to them, right? where we collectively invest in our environment locally, and and it's not just the local tax base that's doing that for parks and other kinds of access to transportation and so forth. And so, in terms of homeowners kind of footing the bill for a lot of these kinds of local taxes. So I think we are so used to thinking about the goal of homeownership and the necessity of homeowners in terms of local economies, that it's hard for us to wrap our heads around another also, optimal kind of reality for communities. But there are examples of it, and that's, I think, the direction that we ultimately would need to go.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good place to end
Okay.
on a call to decommodify housing and build more unsocialized housing, and but also on the, I think the piece is really good at highlighting the tensions that are real within progressive coalitions that are made up of people who believe the right things, except when it comes to, or are really tied to kind of home ownership, given everything. So I've just loved the paper, and I encourage everyone to check it out when it comes out in New Labor Forum in the fall issue, and the report as well. If you want to take a couple seconds to, were you able to put it in the chat?
Oh, I'll do that here.
Yeah.
This is our website, and the report is on the publications page, and there's also another link to it at the Institute for Social Transformation at UC Santa Cruz that would take me a second more to find, but it's linked to on the website itself. So thank you. And I should just say that the work of so many people in New York is an inspiration to us in this project. The work of organized tenants, the work of community land trusts. Hi to John Krinsky, who I guess one of the questions was from. The work of folks working for within labor unions and beyond for social housing. There's such a long history of that, in New York City, and in certain pockets, obviously in California, but the rest of the country takes inspiration from. And ultimately, I think it's going to be this kind of trans-urban, trans-local, national effort that's going to shift policies at a higher level in this country, which is what's going to be required for major change. And so I'm really glad to start this conversation and to just say that we're learning from you all in New York as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you everyone who was able to tune in, and especially to Michael, Nadia, and everyone else who's helped organize this event. And again, check out Miriam's work, both this essay and other stuff that she's been publishing. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.